Okay, so my guest today is Professor Patrick Vaughan of Jagiellonian University. Hello, Patrick.
Hi, Michal. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good, and I have to say that I missed our talks because you are one of the regular guests on my podcast, and we had many fine chats. But this time, I decided to do something more casual. It's not part of any official cycle or anything. I just ever since I saw this film, The Holdovers by Alexander Payne, I had this need to talk to you about it because as soon as
Oh,
I saw it, there was something about this movie that I thought, oh, I would love to hear. I would love to hear your thoughts. You were the first person who introduced me back in the day in your course to sort of the history of America, but also history of the Cold War. And this film takes place at the very beginning of the 1970s. It has a very 1970s vibe. It even has the old Universal logo when it begins. And it's a portrait of an era in American life that you taught me about as I think a first person. So I thought I just called you up and said maybe we can discuss the holdovers, and it turned out that you actually like the film as well. So this is the reason for this meeting. So how did you like the film, and uh, was there any element of this 1970s setting that sort of rang very true to you or familiar to the America that you grew up in? How was it for you, the whole experience of watching the holdovers?
yeah. I thought they did a very good job with this. Sometimes if you have a period piece, I don't know, just off the top of my head, like Dead Poet Society or With Nail and I, or a film we did previously, Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. There's a tendency to exaggerate the setting, and I don't think they did with this one. I think it hit the mood perfectly. 1970 was this period in history where all the idealism of the 60s had sort of disappeared. And it happened gradually throughout the late 60s, leading up to, the moon landing and things like that. They even mentioned that in the film. But by 1970, you have this late 69, you have the Manson murders, the Altamont, the famous Rolling Stones concert, which was a sort of a disaster and kind of a symbol of the anti-Woodstock, vibe of violence and that sort of thing. And that's how the year 1970 started. And I think the film has that sort of blah feeling to it, right? This idea that there's not really anything to look forward to. Nixon had given his famous sort of speech about Vietnam that basically we're not winning the war, but we're not losing it. So we're going to kind of keep forward. And he gave us a speech in 1969 after the famous moratorium protest day. Um, and it was called the silent majority speech. And it was one of these things like people just didn't want to lose in Vietnam, but they didn't have a strategy to win either. And I think that was really depressing. And I think that is set in this mood here that there's nothing to win in this war, but there's a lot to lose personally. And I think the director did a pretty good job of showing that through various characters. And I think there's also sort of a social malaise that you can tell that these boarding schools that had been such a source of pride for the elite, very elite WASP sort of society were beginning to lose their significance. They were starting to become coeducational. You can see in the film there's lots of, you know, drug references and the kids are smoking and there's sort of this feeling that this is outdated and we know it's outdated, but we still have to go through with the motions that we're an elite private school with all of these sort of moral and social guidelines that make us better than everybody else. You can kind of see that that's faded. And I think they got that vibe pretty good. Like when they go into the bar and the so-called townies are playing pinball and he has an altercation with one of the townies. They call townie people the people who live in these college communities, but they don't belong to the university. They're just sort of workers, like, and you can see them in that bar. So I think they did a good job with that. Um, you can see it in films earlier where the usually the protagonist has to be a working class person who accidentally got into these kind of schools, like Goodwill Hunting or Dead Poet Society, or even, I don't know, I think you did it recently, Love Story, where Ryan O'Neal falls in love with Ollie McGraw, but she's Italian and her Protestant father doesn't like a Catholic, sort of. You can really see that old world starting to vanish by 1970, but not completely. And I think that's a big theme of this film.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, this is exactly the year when Love Story opened, and in Love Story you have this very uh, idealized view of this campus sort of life at Harvard. But here we are in this small school called Barton Academy. And the thing that I wanted to ask you first before we discuss the main character, can you tell us a little bit more about this type of school? Because I think that, in Poland we have a completely different sort of frame of reference. But you mentioned yourself, it's a private school. It depends on the donors, right? So what would be the ideal in 1970? What would be the ideal path for somebody who gets to this school, who finishes it, and then goes to do what? Like what type of career this school was supposed
Well,
to foster?
I think, and we're going to lead up to the GI Bill of Rights in later in the conversation, but I think what's really important is to understand by, say, 1900, even 1920, very few Americans went to college. It was actually unusual to finish high school. And so the idea that the American system is classless is a myth. A lot of the early American educational system was founded on very elite exclusion from the rest of society. And there was even a term for it. They didn't even try to hide this. There's a term called the 400 that was printed in some of the big New York magazines in around 1890 about, really, there's only 400 people that really matter in the country, and we're going to list them here, and they could all fit into the ballroom of one of the debutante balls in New York. So there was a very, very elite crust of society. Most of them lived, they were called the Eastern Establishment. Most of them lived either in Boston, Northeast part of the United States, or specifically in the upper east side of Manhattan, right around where today the United Nations is, right around in that neighborhood. It was a very elite neighborhoods, and all of the kids knew each other. They all went to the same events, the same social circles, and they were really intent, these people, on not letting their kids mix with the common folks. That's how you get stories like West Side Story, or what you mentioned before, Love Story. That stuff wasn't supposed to happen. You were supposed to have a very insulated life where you go to school with people, very elite people, very wealthy people, and you want to keep that in the family. So the way to do that is you would send your kids probably to a very elite grade school, and then in high school, you send them to private boarding schools where the kids actually live on campus. They have maids and servants. You could see in this film, they make a kind of a point on that. And they are basically treated like young royalty. A lot of them were literally based on the British educational schools, like Orwell wrote about in some parts, Eton, or these very elite schools where they have standards and they have paintings on the walls of the founding people of the school, and you obey the rules. And these schools were filters for the Ivy League. And in the you can read this in Fitzgerald's novels. There's a lot of this where he didn't really fit in because he was from the Midwest, and these kids all knew each other from these private high schools. And that's the way the American educational system was set up, with these elite schools. feeding into elite societies after college. These private clubs, um, country clubs, Wall Street, where they still knew each other, right? Like I had an occasion once to talk on the phone with David Halberstam, who wrote about Vietnam, very famous book about how these clubs mattered way more than where these people were from, right? And you could still see it. You ask it the question in our email exchange about if this is still going on. And, you know, in the 2000 election, just as the most recent example, George W. Bush went to Andover and Al Gore went to St. Albans in Washington, D.C. And if you just Google those, you can see how much they cost, the notable alumni. And so people would say, yeah, George Bush said he's from Texas and Al Gore said he's from Tennessee, but they're really products of the very elite filtering system. And you could see it in this film. These schools still exist. I think they're having trouble adjusting to the modern era because people are starting to question whether they should exist or not. But they do exist, and they're really good backdrops for a lot of American films that people probably remember. Dead Poet Society is one. The best one I can think of recently, and you can probably name the director, it's escaping me right now, is a movie that came out, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago called Metropolitan,
Mm.
about social kids in Manhattan who are just kind of questioning their own existence, but they're also feeling how are we going to adjust to the real world because we've been sheltered in this very, very elite, prosperous, sort of coddled environment. And usually the films have to have a fish out of water to make them interesting because people actually they don't want to hear these people just talk to each other. So there's another one like that. One of my favorite films in this genre was Scent of a Woman, which actually has that Holdovers theme where it's on Thanksgiving and Al Pacino he's a Vietnam vet and he takes the kid down to New York and they do the tango and he drives a Ferrari and things like this. But there's a lot of this bonding um, between older people and scholarship kids. And I think that's the big theme of the Holdovers. It's very similar to Scent of a Woman, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, The Scent of the Woman was also probably the first film that I thought of, but also I thought of The Last Detail, the 1973
Yeah.
film with Jack Nicholson, where you have this sort of course, there are Marines, but they have to take care of one troublesome kid and actually deliver him to prison. So there's a difference there, but this sort of unruly kid who has to be taken care of, and this also there's something about the vibe of the film, the sort of depressed, a little bit depraved lives that those guys are living.
Yeah. And they're kind of fake. And maybe this was normal in 1900 and but by 1970, in the middle of the Vietnam War, there's a cultural revolution going on. You could see this in Hair. I think I haven't seen that in a while, but just this generational conflict between rich, spoiled kids and the real world, and they start to feel some guilt a little bit. And of course, one of the big themes of the Holdovers is that if you went to college, you were shielded from the draft, um, essentially. And this happened to a lot of contemporary American politicians, and they don't like to talk about it. They used to make a bigger deal about it, but now they don't. But I remember the first one was Dan Quayle in 1988 when the first Bush, named him as vice president. People said, "Oh, you joined the National Guard to get out of Vietnam." And then 4 years later, Bill Clinton had to answer the same sort of charge. Well, I had a deferment. And then now they all have deferments. Biden, Trump, Dick Cheney. Um, and the question and the big question in the room is like, well, how did you get out of Vietnam? And most of them got out because if you went to college, especially if you knew important people, you didn't get that number. But if you were poor and living in a place like Harlem or West Virginia, probably on your 18th birthday, you're going to get a letter in the mail from Uncle Sam saying you have a job for the next year and we're going to train you and we're going to send you to a place probably most likely called Vietnam. And I think a lot of people by 1970 started to ask questions about whether this was moral or not and whether this war actually made any sense. And I think that question is important because it wasn't new in the 1960s or into the 1970s. They got rid of the draft in 1973, I think, because it became sort of a source of embarrassment. But also the idea going back to World War I. And I actually think this is where a lot of the theme starts with this film, because you could see back in World War I, people started to question the morality of sending poor people to war. And it made a lot of money for corporations. And there's a film, I'm sure we've talked about it before, called Good Will Hunting, where the lead character is in talking to his therapist, and he gives him a book by Howard Zinn, The People's History of the United States. And if I was to tell this story from the Howard Zinn point of view, those people that had to go fight in World War I didn't have a choice. Most of them, were people who didn't have an education. They didn't know what they were doing. And when they came back, boom, there was sort of an economic depression. And the third party candidate, people always ask, how come America only has two parties? And if I was to do the Howard Zinn angle on this, there was a third party candidate, the socialist candidate called Eugene Debs, who got anywhere from 6 to 10% of the vote in 1912 as a socialist party candidate. And as soon as World War I started, he spoke out against the war and they threw him in jail, right? As he was against the draft. He said this military draft is illegal, it's immoral, and rich people always start the wars and poor people fight them. And for that, and I'm paraphrasing him, he was sent to prison. And he was in prison in 1920 and he still got 6% of the vote as a third party candidate. And then he just disappeared. He died. And then there was the Roaring 20s and the Great Depression. But there was a big question in the 1930s, the early 1930s, about what to do with these World War I veterans who were promised financial compensation. They were called the bonus army. And they camped in Washington, D.C., and they were eventually forcibly dispersed. And it made Hoover look bad. He was the president at the time. And a lot of people say that's why Roosevelt won in 1932, because he had a little bit more compassion for these people. But it still led to this moral argument. Is it legal or moral for a government to send poor people to fight wars if they don't want to? And that was the origins of something that started by the American Legion. American Legion is sort of a support group for veterans of foreign wars. Something called the GI Bill of Rights, which came about in 1944 in the middle of the Second World War, before we sort of have to number these things. And that meant that if you fought in the military for an extended period of time, I can't remember, a calendar year or something, you would come back and you would be eligible for cheap loans for housing, loans for starting a business, and most importantly, you could go to school, you could go to college. So by 1940s and especially into the 50s, a lot more people were going to college than did so before. And it really changed the kind of educational expectations of millions of people, because now you started to see the sons of bartenders or electricians or cab drivers. They could go to school. For the first time, they were mixing with these previously very elite institutions. And that was part of the kind of the explosive mix in the 60s, because you had so many kids in school. And that's when a lot of critics of the American educational system started to say that its universities have become a business. They're taking everybody. And that's kind of one of the questions you asked. And the GI Bill of Rights was if you went to serve in a war, you were guaranteed to go to college. Um, and that still exists. It only existed for about 10 years, but that's still part of the American fabric. Is if you could even see it on the commercials when I was a kid in the 70s and the 80s, you would be watching a football game and they'd have a military commercial come on. If you join the army, we'll give you a year's money for college. And people were kind of saying, man, that's a weird way to to run a military, right? And but it worked. And there's all sorts of examples of that where people went to join the military in an effort to afford a college education.
So that's exactly the case of Curtis Lamb, the son of the cook in the film, uh, who died in Vietnam, who was killed in Vietnam, and she says to Professor Hanam, the main character played by Paul Giamatti, that Curtis went to Vietnam and he was on the GI Bill, so he so this is exactly the story, right? A young black working class kid who gets his chance to go to school because he went to the army, right? That's the case.
That was his hope, right? And the idea was that he would join the army and then he could go. She mentioned Swarthmore, which is a very elite school, but he didn't make it. They didn't go into the details of how he died, but he was probably killed in action. And you could see the impact that that had on the mother. And in the wars we're having today, I think the media is not focusing on these people enough. Like the the trauma of losing um, a child in war is it's sometimes it's just unbearable. And she lost two, I think, right? Or she lost her husband.
He lost her husband to an industrial accident. Yeah.
And then she lost her son, and then she has this breakdown at a party where she looks really calm, and she's sort of the authoritarian figure of the party, or we're going to do this and we're going to do that. But she's listening to Artie Shaw in the party, and somebody wants to hear a hipper record, and she says, "Don't touch that record." And I think it probably reminded her of her boy. And excuse me, and she had sort of a breakdown. They don't show the breakdown, but it's basically if you lose a child in war and you get that cold message in the mail, sorry, your son was a great guy, but he's dead. That's try to explain that to a mother who's, you
Mm.
know, lost her boy to a war that was unpopular and not really, to a lot of people, didn't make any sense. And I think they did a good job in the film not overdoing this. Like she had a breakdown, and then in the morning she was okay. She said she drank too much, and then everything was okay. But you could see in this very strong character there was a lot of pain there,
Mm.
and I think one of the strong points of the film is she opens up to people who she wouldn't normally socialize with, including a professor of classics. And I think that's the fish out of the water theme that works in this film, and also a young boy uh, that was her son's age. And I think they did a good job. They did a tasteful job in this film of not overdoing that. They could have done it, and I think we got the point. And I think it made it even more sad. This is a very melancholy film. It's set around, if you haven't seen it, it's set around Christmas, and then the whole campus is empty, and it's just, four or five kind of sad people trying to get through the holidays. And they do. But like most good films like this, their life has kind of changed over a period of 4 or 5 days. It's actually they did a good job on this film, I think.
Mm. Well, there's also this quiet and discreet way in which the film shows that the professor and the cook, they are also sharing an alcohol problem, right? They are sharing those whiskeys on the TV, and what I love about this film is that they both open each other to each other's worlds.
Mhm.
I love this moment when he learns from her. He learns from her.
Yeah.
He learns from her about game shows on TV. He doesn't know how
Uh,
they work, and she says, "Oh, you should broaden your horizons."
the Newlywed Game. They're watching that. It's a very sort of silly game show, but everybody remembers this. It was on in the afternoons, and it was just sort of a silly quiz show. But he was a sort of in the ivory tower, so he thought, "What is this? What are you watching?" Right? And she says, "You don't know the Newlywed Game," but she has sort of an insightful wisdom of the Newlywed Game that is actually sort of smarter than he was. He has all the degrees and letters with his name because he's a professor, but she understands the psychology, says they're going to get divorced, I can tell. and it was kind of a subtle part of American pop culture, but it was significant. They did a good job of, part of the problem with trying to relate some American films is people don't get some of the subtle nuances. But the Newlywed Game, she was sitting there every night drinking and smoking a cigarette and watching the Newlywed Game, and he had no other choice but to join her in that. And it was sort of charming in a way. And she got as a present, the book by Marcus Aurelius, about how to be a Stoic and a classical wisdom, and so there was a sharing there. And I think most good films or most good novels or just life stories have that. You can learn from people that aren't like yourself. And sometimes that's the best way to learn. Um,
Mm,
I
yeah.
always think when I tell people to travel, I always tell them to try to work when you travel because then you see the real environment of that atmosphere and you get to meet people that aren't just backpackers or something. You meet the real kind of people. And I think this film does a good job with that. She was a great character. I think Giamatti's character was good. The boy was good. I think all of them were really well played. And,
Right.
you
Right.
know, you know,
But also the Jamati character, he teaches the classics, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I was wondering because he's clearly despised by the other members of the faculty. Like he's not very well liked. He's also not like a top professor at the school. Like he's somewhere in the middle. Of this pecking order. But is the classics still taught this way today, or is it also something of that era that was the tail end of teaching, Latin, Greek,
Yeah.
that was also connecting to this earlier, right? Classical
Yeah,
education, right?
they had very classical educations at these sort of schools, these institutions. They were very founded in Latin. Most of the kids had to take Latin as a language. They had to learn all of the classics and Shakespeare and so forth, and all of the sort of the morality of the ancient world and so forth. Whereas the other side of that, where places like where I went to school, we were basically trained to be practical workers or functional members of society. The Land Grant Act during the Civil War gave all the states, that's why American campuses look like parks. They're much different than European campuses where they have a certain amount of real estate and they're basically saying we're a growing country. We need practical people. So we need schools that don't teach the classics. We need schools like state schools where people learn how to be engineers or technicians or that's why a lot of these schools are called Texas A&M, for example. It's how to be, you see these around Poland, like these trade schools, right? How to be a miner or how to be a farmer or how to be an engineer. So these people a lot of times in real life had this very classical education, but they had no practical functioning experience in life. And they were sort of, if outside of that environment, they were sort of useless. And there's a lot of that in this film where Giamatti's a professor and he thinks he knows everything, but he doesn't know the basics of how the outside world works, right? They even mentioned it. When's the last time you were off campus, right? And he couldn't remember. And that's part of this film is that I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but he kind of has this prison where he's at this cocktail party and he says, "Well, I graduated from here and then I had to escape." And it's very practical. She's a bartender. She says, "You didn't escape. You're still here." Right? She says it politely, but she's a much more well-rounded person, and she's just a bartender in his eyes. But she's also happier, it seems. She's, got a pretty simple job at the university, but she's a townie, as they call it, right? And she looks like she doesn't have the emotional angst that he does, and he has all of this fancy education. And I think they did a pretty good job in this film intentionally showing that if you're an academic and you think you know everything, that can make you a very miserable person and a very uncomfortable person to be around. And it's a danger in my profession, and I see a lot of it. I don't like to talk about it, but you can get really insulated thinking that books are the most important thing in the world. But you can see in this film, experience is much more important than reading a book. And that's, I think, the moral of the story when he leaves. Um, he travels and he finally escapes. He gets out, right? And it kind of reminds me of one of my favorite novels. It's called A Confederacy of Dunces, and it's about a guy who's a perpetual medievalist who thinks everything is about books and reading and writing and everything. And he finally escapes with his girlfriend in a taxi, and he's out in the real world. And it's I think they probably had some influence on this novel. I mean, this novel influenced the theme of this book. I could see it in certain ways. If you haven't read this novel, it's a fantastic, humorous book written from the point of view of a guy who is just obsessed with sort of the Middle Ages. He wants a king, and everything is referenced in the Middle Ages, but he has no outside life. And it's a comedy novel, and this is sort of a dark comedy, this film. But they both have this idea that if you're an academic, you can get so wrapped up in your insulated world of words and books that you don't understand what's really happening in the world. And that could make you a dangerous person in some ways, and also a boring person where people don't really want to be around you. Giamatti finds this out, several times during the films, that everybody hates him. Um, and he kind of grows out of this. It's a film where everybody grows a little bit, and I think they did a good job with it.
Yeah, I agree. And it's a funny thing. I actually read Confederacy of Dances on my first trip to the States when I went to Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, and somebody recommended it to me then. And I remember I was laughing out loud when I was reading it. It's really, really funny, if a very, very funny book. Uh,
Ignatius Riley it's a
yeah,
comical character, but you have this unusual mix of sympathy, but also sort of you want him to get out of his
yeah,
cage,
the
you know. So
tragic,
you know,
the author's life was pretty tragic because he took his own life.
it's
But
a
yeah, the
terrible
book,
story. But his mother got the book published, and and now I think just I remember before, I don't know, 20 years ago, I rarely heard about that book. But I think now one of the good things about our social media and the internet is a lot of good things get passed around a lot more readily than in previous years. I think Marcus Aurelius is one of those examples. That was the book that was used in this film. I see that everywhere now.
Hmm.
15-year-old kids are reading it. And I think that's one of the good things about having too much information out there is you can pick the good stuff and leave the bad stuff if you're smart, or if you want to.
What do you think of, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm done. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking of the Paul Giamatti character, and I wanted to drill this topic just a bit more because he's about, I guess, 50 in the film. That's my guess. So it's 1970. So he had to be born like, let's say 1920, something
Yeah.
like that. So he would be, and because he mentions at one point that he wanted to go to the army in 1941. So
Yeah.
he actually. was rejected because of health reasons, and I think he became like air warden or something like that.
Yeah, it looked like they gave him some sort of domestic job where I can't remember it. I only watched the film once, but they mentioned that he had some job where he's in charge of the searchlight or something. I can't, I don't
Right,
quote
right, right, right. But
some
but
job where he's not in combat, So
but he to my mind he embodies this sort of hard, difficult, and great moment in American history. And I mean, the Great Depression and then Second World War, this war that was, universally perceived as just and
mhm.
won, and it was a triumphant moment to be an American in 1940s and 50s. So and here in this movie, he says to one character, it's at this cocktail party, he says that the world doesn't make sense anymore, right? That it's not what it used to be. He doesn't know what to say to his students because he lived through a moment when things clicked. It seemed all right, but this movie shows him at a different point in this history, right? Or also national history.
Yeah. And I had a professor, and he sort of was in the Howard Zinn school, and he was a sort of a he went to Yale Divinity School, but I had his class on the 60s. That's actually where I got the idea in some ways to teach these decade classes, which I think you took. Maybe you didn't take them. You might have been before that. But I teach now where I teach a class. I spend 15 weeks or whatever on the 50s, and then we do the 60s the next year, and then the 70s. And each decade has its own personality. And the 60s is really complicated because it started with such ambition and idealism with Kennedy, this famous speech at Rice University. Why do we go to the moon? Because it's hard, it's difficult. And then you ended with Kent State, uh, Altamont, the Manson sort of drama, and everything just seemed like it didn't work anymore. And I think in 1970, a lot of people felt that way. My dad went to Korea. He was drafted. He didn't, he just got something in the mail. He was playing basketball at Seattle University with, a pretty high profile college basketball team, and he got drafted. He said, they put him on a boat, and he's in there with probably 300 guys he's never seen before, including the first black people, which he had never seen outside of the South. And war has a way of melding societies and putting them together. And I think one of the origins of the civil rights movement was people are saying, well, if you can fight for your country, you should be able to vote or sit at a lunch counter at Woolworths and expect some dignity. And in some ways, war opens up things that are positive in society, but it's also, I would never want to glorify war. I think what's going on now in Ukraine, I think there's going to be books written about this in 10 years. It's going to be horrifying. And I don't like to say that, but there is no war. If you've ever experienced war, most of the people that have don't talk about it.
Hmm. Right.
My cousin, I told you he just died last month. Excuse me. And he joined the Marines when he was 19 years old because he was bored with college. And he said when he got there, he was the only person in his platoon or whatever who went to college. Everybody else was just from some city. And his job, and he did this, his job was to write the parents when somebody died. And he said it wasn't official. There was an official notice that went out. And he said these were kind of cold. So he wanted to tell the parents how good a kid this kid was, what he did, why he died, what he did when he was dying. And he said it's unbelievably hard
Hmm.
to do that. And so I think Giamatti in this character is grasping with this idea, is war glamorous, even if it's for a good cause. So many people died in World War One. If you look at some of these documentaries about World War One, when these people had to come back from war, they called the term shell shock. It's actually a sort of an official medical term, I think. You can check on that. But trying to see people actually physically obliterated and then coming back and trying to work as a shoe salesman was really difficult for these people. And I think Rambo was about that. Rambo, the first film, people forget that the first Rambo film was a very introspective story about a guy coming back and trying to find people he served with in these small American towns. And later they made it into a cartoon where he goes and fights and liberates Afghanistan with a knife in a canteen or something. But the first one was about the impact of war. And I think the Holdovers is a very subtle way to show that some people fight in these wars and some people don't, right? If you haven't seen the film, it's a lot of the kids are, it's 1970, they're going on ski trips, they're having fun in boarding school and that sort of thing. And the poor kids in the town where they go to school, the one guy has a hook on his arm. You remember that at the pinball machine. And so it's a very difficult film. And I think they did it in a subtle way, but you can see when people go to war, wealthy people usually don't have to fight, at least in this film. There was an article I remember reading in the 1990s where if you go to most American college campuses, the World War One monument has maybe 400 names of the kids who died in the war, and then World War II has maybe 600, and then Vietnam has 20, and by the 1990s, the Persian Gulf War, there's none, right? Or like zero, right? They just say that nobody in this school went to war, right? So I think we're dealing with that now as a society, trying to, um, and I don't think people are very honest about it, actually. I used to think the best system would be if you're going to fight these wars, when somebody turns 16, instead of going to college in America, I think you spent a semester in Pennsylvania and you probably got an image of the American campus life. When you're 18, you go there, and a lot of times you just drink beer for a year in the dorms on a Tuesday night. What are you going to do? Oh, let's drink some beer. And then you end up, it's fun, but you waste a lot of that very important time of your life when you're making a transition into adulthood. And I used to think, because I played sports, and I thought sports was the most sort of similar thing to the military, that you had to be somewhere at 8 in the morning, you had to be somewhere at 3 o'clock, and all your friends are watching Star Trek in their pajamas all day, getting high or whatever. And there's a really two levels of American society that people don't want to talk about anymore, is that if you don't want to serve in the military, you don't have to. And the people that are doing it, and I've seen this in Poland here, where we're talking, you see there's a very big difference between a suburban sort of John Hughes movie high school and the kids that are here in Poland in the army and in the military. And I don't think people are as honest about that as they should be. And I think this movie, The Holdovers, is trying to make that point, setting it back to 1970, because then we can be more honest. I think there's one thing about movies now is if we make them period pieces, the characters can smoke and they can use sort of offensive language, and nobody's that offended by it. But she does a pretty good job in her dialogue. She was excellent in this about, why did my boy have to go to war and you did it, right? Or these private school kids, why don't they have to fight in these wars, right? Why do I have to lose my boy? And it was a very subtle film. I think one of the reasons it didn't do better in terms of just the discussion in pop culture is it was a very subtle film. They were making a very subtle message, but it was a very melancholy film about who goes to war and who doesn't. And and I don't have the answers to that, but I used to have a solution, and I even wrote about it once. Is what Americans, when they turn 17, they should get a choice where they go to kind of a dormitory type of thing where you learn a skill, a trade, electric, how to be an electrician or a plumber or a programmer or a, automotive mechanic, or you get military training. And everybody, it's a blind lotto. So everybody goes to some place where you don't know where you're going. And that would be a good thing for these people, like in this movie, that were going to these elite boarding schools. If they ended up rooming with somebody from Oklahoma or Kansas or Harlem, and they all have to learn how to be electricians together, or learn how to be plumbers together, or mechanics, learn some practical skill. When I was, I don't want to go on too long about this, but where I went to junior high school, it was called Standard Junior High. It was owned by the Rockefellers. That's why it was called Standard. The oil company owned it, and it was a poor school in terms of our. Most of my friends were. I can just tell you, just my four main friends. Their fathers were a bartender, an electrician, a probation officer, a truck driver, and a policeman. That's who went to that school. But on my report card, my classes were like auto shop, metal shop, mechanical drawing, industrial arts, where we learned how to weld and we learned how to forge. We had to use a forge with a hammer and things like that. And those people, I think, in our today's society are much more satisfied than the people that get these very philosophical educations and they have to go try to figure out what real life is. And I think the people in my life, I'm getting older now, but the people that are most well adjusted are the people that had those jobs, like my brother, who's a house builder. My brother he can build a house in Seattle and it could be a millimeter square. The guy's a genius. And he also has a finance degree, but he says, I don't want to work in an office my whole life. So he went and he builds houses. And my favorite thing I ever did as a kid was help him out in the summer. And I did this even when I was teaching here. I would go when I was teaching you. I spent the summers working with my brother, just carrying plywood through the mud. And I think in our society today, we're a little bit empty because we don't have to prove anything. We don't have the rites of passage that uh, previous societies did. I think we've lost that. Even at these elite schools, they at least had like a graduation or they had these tests that you had to do. But I think in our own contemporary society, we've really lost track of sacrifice or having to do something that's difficult. There's something really good about life and getting a task a task that's hard and actually finishing it. And I think that's the best way to go to school. And I think America now, the high schools are just promotional machines. You know, you can do a minimal effort and you get promoted until the person's 18 and they say, well, what have you done your last 12 years? Well, I can't remember. And I think if you ask me what's wrong with modern society, and especially my own country, the United States, that's part of it. There's no effort where you have a specific task, you have to do it, you have to finish it, and you get it done. Instead, we have a lot of immediate gratification, a lot of uh, things that don't really matter that much being stressed in places like social media, for example. I don't want to just pick on social media, but that's off the top of my head. But if you go to the military, you know, my dad, a lot of, he was in the Navy and a lot of his friends were just, they would talk about, they would have never met each other unless they met in the military because they had nothing in common except that. And that's what I think this film does pretty well. I think Scent of a Woman did that pretty well. You could see the Al Pacino character had nothing in common with his immediate family. They were arguing and he had no respect for them, but he respected this kid, Charlie, and they bonded together. And I think that this Holdovers has some of that same theme to it. That's a long answer. Sorry about
No,
that.
no, no, no. That's good, and I agree, and I also, I think that there are movies that are great at showing that doing things together when you're from differing backgrounds and that this experience of doing something together or of going somewhere, someplace, it can really change you because it pulls you away from this comfort zone of your own, library or four walls. And even if films like In the Heat of the Night, you have a black police officer from Philadelphia and this southern cop.
That
So
that's funny because I was just thinking about the one where Tony Curtis is changed. Was it to Sidney Poitier, and they had to survive together as they were chained together on they
yeah,
were
the Defiant ones. Yeah,
yeah,
the
and that's those kind of films where you have to adjust to somebody else's value system and you learn from each other. I think those are great American films. You know,
Yeah, and I think they could work as, this sort of antidote to this extreme case of, living inside your own bubble, which we have right now. People
yeah,
are creating those bubbles which are practically, impenetrable. It's basic. And those movies, sometimes in a very simple way, reminded you that you need to get out there. You need to challenge yourself. You need to challenge your notions of how a day can be spent, or what is work. There's this book. I don't know if you know it. It's by this guy. I don't know if he's still alive, but Matthew Crawford
mhm.
wrote this book, which is called. I just looked it up. It's called Shop Class as Soulcraft: An Inquiry into the Value of Work. And
Oh,
he sort of wrote this book saying that it's much that he learned more by working with his hands and with other people, like than by reading books and stuff.
I must have had, you know, 75 courses in college, and I remember about three of them, or
Mm.
probably a little bit more than that. But I remember my woodshop teacher when I was in seventh and eighth grade, Paul Henry. Everybody had to be on their desk. We had a project. You'd have the class for 50 minutes. And after 50 minutes, we'd all work. We had power tools. I mean, power tools now, they would probably be illegal. We had lathe, a disc sander, a joiner, a circular saw, and we were just expected to use them responsibly. And at the end of the class, a bell would ring, and we all had 7 minutes where we picked our broom or whatever, and we all had specific jobs. And that was the class, 60 minutes. And then we'd go to English class or something, or math or whatever. But in the shop class, you really learn how to finish something and it's yours and you take some pride in it. And what I remember about Mr. Henry, he never helped us. I mean, he would say, if you got a problem, he'd say, hey, figure your problem out. That's what this class is about, managing problems, figuring something out, overcoming it. And at the end, you got a project. I still have a shoe shine kit I made in that class. And I have
Mm.
um, a hamburger press. We would just make these simple things. In his metal shop class, I have a sugar scoop, a funnel that we would make out of paint cans, sheet metal.
Mm.
But I loved those classes. And then when I got older, I went to another school. I moved. My dad got a new job, and all of the classes were sort of theory or English or books that were good, but I could read those books on my own time. I think school is about how to be a productive, cooperative person who can solve problems.
Right.
I know somebody now who's a therapist, and she wouldn't mind if I said this. She says most of her patients now are in their 20s because they get out of school and they don't really have a purpose. They
Mm.
don't really know why they're around. And I think one of the things about the holdovers is you see a lot of people in search of their purpose. And one of the good things about the film is I think they kind of help each other find something to live for.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah.
agree, and I remember that we all I went to Polish school in the 90s, but I remember we had this sort of technical class. It was called a technical class, and we also had to do make some things, although it was quite disorganized. But I remember the single most exciting class was when we were supposed to do like this little keychain with a piece of wood, and you were free to burn something like I don't know, a little drawing, or I don't know, or some word onto this little piece of wood. I think every single safety violation that could happen happened, in that class. I don't think it was safe at all, now that I think of it.
Sometimes life isn't safe. I mean,
Yeah,
that's,
exactly. We went to the basement, to this very archaic kind of, like tool shed almost, like, and then the teacher showed us how to do it, and then all of us, burned something into this little plaque of wood. And I remember that because there was this huge fight. Some people were actually writing or burning their own home addresses, and we're saying
mhm.
that's stupid. If you put your home address to your key, then you lose the key, and whoever finds it can enter your place. But it just triggered some memories. But I wanted to ask you about this teach. I mean, the Paul Giamatti character, because I think this film is also like an like an homage to this crusty old teacher,
Mhm.
who can be very important in your life. You meet a
Yeah,
teacher who may not be the nicest person, but he actually teaches you something. Did you have people like this
I,
in your life?
there's the famous Goodbye, Mr. Chips or whatever.
Yeah.
There's a sort of a genre in American about professors, but I just did a podcast with my basketball coach. My basketball coach, and I taught you, I'm not a young person anymore. He just retired in January, and I did a podcast with him um, during the lockdown because he was basically fired. Kind of, I didn't ask him why, but there was some, because he was too tough, and I just wanted to thank him for being tough. And and I remember his practices. They were based on John Wooden's practices at UCLA, these really tough discipline where everybody had a certain goal that we had to meet. And I thanked him because nobody remembers their easy classes, I think. And I always tell that when people say, "Oh, your exams are too hard. There's too much information." And I said, "Yeah, if I gave you an easy exam, you wouldn't remember it, right?" And I think life is like that, and that's a metaphor, right? We need challenges as human beings to overcome them to make us feel worth something, right? If life is easy, I mean, that's a lot of the people now, they're finding out it's a bad thing to leave their kids so much money because you get rid of the incentive. And I know I don't know these people, but I read about it. There's this, and one of the great films in this genre that I really loved is, it's not a period piece, but it was maybe 20 years ago. It's a film called Rushmore, the Wes Anderson film, which I thought was fantastic. It's one of my favorite films, and Bill Murray is in it.
Yeah.
And they use music. Wes Anderson uses music better than any director I've ever seen. Maybe Tarantino is close, but I think Wes Anderson just hits it. They actually, in the Holdovers, they used the Cat Stevens song, the same one they use in Rushmore, when she's flying the kite.
Mhm.
But they once asked Bill Murray, "What's the hardest thing about being famous?" Right? And he says, "Having rich kids," right? Because I love them, and I know they're not going to get the same lessons that I had just being a simple Chicago Cubs fan growing up. I love them, so I can't tell them they don't have a lot of money, and that's hard. And I think a lot of people are starting to feel that way about too much comfort,
Right.
and if that's good or not for a society, and how you could ignore complex things in your life by over medicating or escaping them or things like this. And I think Bill Murray in that film is a really good example of this, where he's sort of in the middle, and there's another scholarship kid at a private school who has to overcome something, and his dad's a barber, and he's kind of embarrassed by it. But it's a really charming film, and I think it gets to this essence that if you have everything, nothing means anything. Um, I guess it goes back to Midas or whatever. If everything is gold, you don't appreciate
Yeah.
tin or bronze or whatever. And I think one of the things that the holdovers does a really good job is they don't beat you head over that, but they show that sometimes sacrifice is meaningful. Um,
Mm.
Paul Giamatti's character is unlikable at first. Everybody hates him. He's not a very charismatic person. He thinks he doesn't really have any friends. I don't think he has one personal friend in the film, does he? I mean,
No,
does he?
no, not really. Not
None.
really.
And you see him growing slowly throughout the film, but they don't over dramatize it. He just kind of picks it up. Oh, okay, that's important. A game show over a cigarette in the with the cook is a meaningful part of life, even if it's not a thesis or he
Yeah.
doesn't write an article on it, right? And some of my best friends, in fact, I mean, I'm in academia, so I love my colleagues and everything. I work at a great place, But I'm just as comfortable going home with guys that were in the Air Force or in the military or, just had a simple life with a couple kids, and that sort of thing. So I think academic life, and they don't say this directly, but it can be pretty lonely. It can be pretty, if you don't have a complement to your life, like an exterior hobby or something like this, you can get caught up in that. I wrote a book. That book on Brzezinski almost killed me because I had a deadline for it and I had to do it. And I didn't like how it kind of turned me into a monster because I had to sleep. You're thinking about, you know, you wake up in the morning, you're eating breakfast, you're thinking about chapter two. What do you got to do? Uh, you're taking a shower, you're kind of going, oh man, I got to get a conclusion on that chapter three. I got to send it to the editor by Friday. And pretty soon you're 40 years old, right? Like this Giamatti character. And you're kind of saying, I don't have any friends. I'm living in this research, writing about things that are not directly related to my life.
Mm,
And you could see that it takes a toll on people. I think academics are some of the, you know, best people I know. And I'm really happy I did it. But I see a lot of that loneliness where people are just saying, man, another article. I just finished one. I got to write another one and another one, another one. And their friends are out playing golf or, playing cards or watching Star Trek in their pajamas at 4 o'clock. I mean, they're relaxing and they're enjoying life. I think the Giamatti character is a lesson where he had to go live. At the end of the movie, your podcast is called Spoiler Master, so I can spoil it. He actually goes and lives in these places that he's been writing and reading about. He actually goes to Italy and he goes to the sites of the Peloponnesian War that he's been lecturing about for 30 years, but he's never been to. And I think that's a great way to end this film, where he just says, I'm getting out of the cage. I'm going to live. I'm going to see things that I've been writing and lecturing 18-year-old kids about for 30 years. I'm gonna and he learns that in 5 weeks or 5 days over Christmas vacation. And I think he learned it from the characters. And they learned something from him too. I don't, he gave them this Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which is a very solid book. If you're going to read a book, I think that's in the top five. And they kind of learn from him too. He helps the kid out with his father. He takes the blame for that, the incident.
yeah.
So he's actually at the end of the film, he gives up something too. He learns something, right? And he kind of learns that he made a lot of sacrifices that he kind of regretted, right? When he lies about his academic record at the end, where they say, hey, what have you been doing for 30 years? And he just makes up a job. And back then you could do that, right? Probably harder to do that now. But and his friend, the student who was with him, says, why did you just lie? You've been telling us for 4 years we can't lie. And he
Mm.
says, well, you know, sometimes you have to lie, right? So everybody kind of makes some compromises in this film. And I think it's a wonderful, subtle film, that you learn a lot from. The film that I remember most about Vietnam, and I asked you about it before. It's on YouTube now. Jan Michael Vincent is in it. It's called Tribes, and it was a made-for-television movie set in 1970. I kept thinking about this when I watched this film. Tribes was made in 1970, and it's about a hippie kid who doesn't want to go to the Marine Corps, but he gets drafted, so he has to go. And he's the best soldier in the boot camp, but they're hard on him because he didn't go to school. He's a hippie, and it's just really, it's only an hour and a half, and if you want to watch a good film on Vietnam and on how it divided society, you can watch this. It's McGavin is in it, and then oh, there's not a lot of stars in there, but it shows Jan Michael Vincent just trying to survive boot camp. And when he graduates, he says, I'm not going to war. I don't believe in war, right? And they say, well, you've got to believe in war. This is our system. And some of the speeches in that film are really good. I recommend that. It's called Tribes. I know we're talking about the Holdovers, but
No, no, no. That's good. That's good. I actually I agree with what you're saying. I have one more question which I didn't send you before.
yeah.
Were you ever a holdover, quote unquote? Were you ever, did you ever stay on campus in like during Christmas or
Oh,
Thanksgiving, or were you in
I
that
I
situation?
I was always a holdover because I was either working. I had a job like she had. I was a cook in the. I went to University Chico State where I was actually the chef. I made the hamburgers and the grilled cheese sandwiches and things like this, and that was a great job because I got to eat for free. And my girlfriend, she worked next door, and I was sort of the dishwasher, and so I would stay doing that job. But the funniest story I have is I was at the University of Delaware. It's 1988. And I was a little bit older than most of the other exchange students, but we didn't have a place to go over Thanksgiving. So they arranged it. So we took a big bus up to New York City and then to Boston. And these people for exchange students were from California, Montana, Texas, and we're in Delaware, which is just south of Philadelphia. It's on the way to New York. And they said, well, we made a decision, Patrick. You're driving the bus. And I said, oh, okay. Why am I driving the bus? And they said, well, you're the most responsible and we can only have one person. So I drove the bus up to New York. And this is a true story. And if he's out there, I hope he doesn't mind me telling this story. But the guy from New York had never been to New York. He's from Montana, went to Montana State, and he was just a great guy. But he was kind of from Montana. It kind of reminded me of Midnight Cowboy in a way. And I said, okay, let's go get a drink here and we'll watch this college football game. And I'm going to go use the toilet. I'll be right back. And I come back and I said, what happened? And he goes, I don't have any money. I said, well, what happened to your money? And he played he played the 3 card monte game outside. I was gone for maybe 20 minutes or something. I forget, maybe I made a phone call or something, and he lost all of his money. And he says, I can't believe I lost all my money. I watched that game on TV, the shell game, where the guy says, oh, that's got 100. And back then there was no ATMs, not as much. And I had to cover him for for 4 days. I had to pay him. And but it's a great story. But he goes, I feel so stupid. I can't believe I fell for that trick. Like I've always wanted to try that trick, and I fell for it. And the guy took $400 in 20 seconds. and I said, well, welcome to New York. It was kind of like the Jack Lemmon,
Yeah,
the out of towners or whatever.
yeah.
And but driving home on the turnpike on Sunday, it took us about 13 hours to get from Boston to Delaware. It was only usually takes about 3 hours or 4 hours. I felt like we had bonded as a family because we did everything together. We stayed in a hotel right by Madison Square Garden, and everybody was kind of afraid of New York because they're from Texas and Kansas and California. But we all made it back together, and we knew each other so much better on Sunday night than we did on Thursday morning when we left, or Wednesday. And it was kind of one of those experiences where we felt like we went through military together in a way, right? It was obviously not the same, but you went through camp. Like I had to watch out for everybody. Okay, we got 20 people, everybody in the bus, right? And driving in Manhattan in this bus, it was probably the size of a school bus, was really hard. And I said, well, I got to do it. I don't have a choice. So I found a garage as soon as possible. But it was a great weekend, and I remembered it. I worked in Alaska one year in a fish cannery, and I kind of felt the same way where you didn't know anybody when you started, and eight weeks later you felt like you know everything about their family and everything like this. So travel is good for that.
Mm.
Um, but I like the holdovers. I kind of liked staying in a college town because you got to see it in its natural state. All the college kids were gone, and you got to meet the townies. I'll just end with one story because there was a townie I used to hang out with in the bar called the Town Lounge. It's in Chico, um, California, and he was a Vietnam vet. And I asked him, "What's the thing he remembers most about Vietnam?" And we'd be drinking a beer or whatever, and he was a really interesting guy. And he said, "There's no rules in war. There's no red lights and green lights. Anybody can do anything they want to you, and you have no control over it. And there's no 911 call, that's the emergency call in the United States, where you can get help. There's no police. You are the police." And he says, if there's a snake hanging off the branch and you're walking through the jungle, nobody's going to save you from that. And I think that's what I remember about Vietnam, is this kind of chaos this uneasiness. And the way these people were treated when they came back is a national scar on the American historical experience, I think. I think they tried to deal with it a little bit in the 80s through movies like Platoon. And there's a great HBO series called Letters Home from Vietnam. I think that's on YouTube. I use it in my classes, the 60s and 70s class, about what it was like to come back from war. Um, but I think the American college experience, with which I just described to you in the last 40 minutes or however long we've been talking about, can be a great rewarding experience if you really take risks, if you go on exchange programs or you work in the cafeteria or you meet friends that are different from you or you you just try to experience new things. But I think too many people now in America, they just go to college and then they expect to get a job when they get out, and they don't have that experience that they might have had in the 60s when this film was set, or in 1970. But I don't know, I'm getting a little bit cynical as I get older, but I still think that challenge is good for people. I think sports is good for people. I think small tasks like doing the dishes in the morning is important for people. I remember I had a boxing trainer, and he says, life is easy. He said, inch by inch, life's a cinch, yard by yard, life is hard. What he meant is if you take every day and you do the simple things, the little things, and you get a habit of that, over time, your habits are going to make you. And he was really a guy that never went to a day of college, never went. He just said, I got into Harvard, didn't want to go. And he went, he's a guy, he's a boxing trainer, he's a deer hunter and all that kind of thing. But he always had this wisdom that the professors I knew didn't really have. So life is about interacting with both of those situations if you can, right? And I think Giamatti in the movie was forced to. He didn't want to, right? He was the guy had lied about his mother being sick, so he lied, and so Giamatti got stuck with it. And but he ended up being probably that being the most important 5 days of his life, you know, and he didn't see it coming. Kind of like Charlie in Scent of a Woman, or Al Pacino's character in Scent of a Woman. You don't see these things coming, and someday, an accident can happen in your life where you don't see it coming, and 4 days can change it. But if you don't take the chance, um,
Yeah,
you don't learn the lesson, right?
I agree, and I think for me, the movie is really about that the nature of your character is revealed only in adversity, like that your everyday life when you are in this sort of sheltered comfort of your everyday life. Uh, that's not necessarily the situation where you really show what you are made of. You need to get out of that. You need to experience other people, other countries, other, anything that's different that,
I was at a birthday party last weekend, and I asked everybody who was a little bit older than me.
Oh.
I asked if they remembered December 13th, 1981, where they were in Stonvoyani and everything. And they all, so it was a terrible time, but they all said, but it was a meaningful time.
Mm,
And we remember everything about that morning. So we're kind of bonded as a generation where we went through something very difficult. But they, at the end, they kind of were smiling about their stories. Oh, I remember we had the vodka party and there was curfew, and oh yeah, remember that. And so even in the worst times, you can take some good things out of difficulty. And they were all kind of smiling about it, even if they remember, they were all 12 or 13 years old, probably, or maybe a little bit older than that. But
right.
I think Poland, the whole historical experience has been difficult. That's why it's such an interesting country. Um,
Right, right.
and anyway, it's a great film. Mihal, I'm really happy that you asked me to come back again. I'm a little bit hot. It's about
No, no, no. It's for everyone watching this. We are recording on a very, very hot day. It's hot in Warsaw where I am. It's hot in Krakow where you are. So
yeah,
it's a wintry film, but we discussed it, in this in the heat of the
yeah.
sun.
But
So
it
no,
was
it's
really
my
good.
pleasure. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much
So
for
if I look like I'm sweating, I am. So
speaking. Thank
it's
you.
pretty warm. So
So
thanks for
I
and
hope that you will get to do this again, and have a great September,
yeah.
and see you soon, maybe in
And
person.
once again, congratulations all the good work you're doing. I'm really happy to see it. So
Thank you so much.
okay. Have a good
Have a good one.
okay.
Okay.